Welcome to The Bold Blueprint, a podcast for modern educators who dare to think differently. Here we explore the intersection of education and leadership, diving into bold strategies, innovative teaching, and the mindset shifts that drive real impact. Whether you're in the classroom, leading a team, or shaping the future of education, this is your space to learn, grow, and lead with confidence. Okay, Barbi. I before we start today's podcast, I've missed you. I feel like I don't know. I feel like it's good to have the band back together.
Yeah. It was definitely odd recording without you. I'm pretty honest in that it's like Jamie's good at helping bringing me back on track into line on my side quests in how I think and talk. And I don't know, it's good just bouncing off you when we have great guests on as well.
Totally. And, it's been really exciting and invigorating to see our podcast have so many episodes out there. And I don't know, I've had quite a few people approach me over the last couple of weeks and saying, hey, I've listened to the podcast and what are your thoughts on this? Have you had that experience yet?
Yeah, we're getting a lot of direct feedback. Especially on email, actually, not as much on social, a bit of both, but pretty honest feedback, especially as if we talk about anything, whether it's personal or what might be considered a more difficult topic. A lot of, I guess the sentiments usually like, thanks for making me feel heard type stories.
Yeah.
That's what I'm getting a lot.
Yeah, wow. Well, I definitely am so happy to be back, and for all the listeners out there, it wasn't anything to worry about. It was really I had a bit of an urgent thing to get to last week, but yeah, I think the next couple of weeks we've got some really exciting guests that are going to be jumping onto the podcast. I'm so excited about who we're about to bring on. But today we've got someone by the name of Eric. Hello, Eric.
Hello, Barbi. Hello, Jamie. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no worries. Do you want to give a bit of a background about yourself to start off with?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. As you said, my name's Eric. I'm the Risk and Compliance Coordinator at Three Bridges, and we're a provider in Sydney who operates 18 outside school hours care services, and we also operate other services across the aged care sector. So very excited today to be speaking with you about risk and compliance, my favourite topic. And Barbi, I know we've had a couple of conversations previously prior to today's session, so I'm very excited.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Jamie.
No, go.
I was actually, this is one of my side quests on the risk and compliance side. Eric and I have spoken about this and I like his take on it. So that's why I wanted him to come on. It's probably people going like, oh, risk and compliance, where I'm like, yay. But we'll help you end up being yay, hopefully by the end of it, especially if you hear, I guess, maybe a different angle to how you might look at it. But Eric, I feel like I first came across years ago when he was still a teacher. And I'm not going to take claim to drawing you back to USH, but I will say I hopefully played a hand in getting, because I call it the dark side. It's not the dark side, but I love bringing teachers over to the dark side in USH. And I guess for listeners' perspective, so background in USH, how long have you been in USH now?
4 years with my current organisation, but no, you are right. We did first connect probably about 5 years ago when I was looking to transition back to USH after my time working as a casual during uni, after school care, and probably like many people who've entered the sector, didn't really see USH as a long-term career, and then I went and taught for a while and thought, hey, I miss USH, and here we are.
That's awesome. I mean, it's interesting because both myself and Barbi, I guess we're kindred spirits in that regard. I worked in an USH service for about 4.5 years in Coogee Care Centre. Shout out to the CCC. And I actually know Three Bridges as well because I think Tina used to work at Three Bridges as well, right?
Yeah, a little bit before my time, but yes, you're right.
Yeah. So
I remember her too.
For a while, and what I'm kind of excited about talking about compliance with you today, Eric, is I historically have worked with multiple people from a compliance space, and what I have found is that there's two breeds of compliance officers or compliance people. One where they love to quote the regulations, and it becomes more of a like regulation, blah 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 says this, and becomes a bit more of a quote of the regs rather than a how to support and help and have that kind of perspective. And I think what I'm excited today is this idea of compliance, this idea of safety around how it's everybody's responsibility. How does your role kind of fit within that? Are you a quota of the regs and kind of safeguards and stops people from learning, or do you provide systems and tools to empower people to work within that regulative space?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's certainly probably some context where it's appropriate to quote the regs or from, an educational point of view. But I know we've spoken previously, particularly with Barbi, and I think we need to be reminded that the regs are there to underpin quality practice. And that's the purpose, essentially. So, yeah, definitely that more development, that understanding of why the regs are there is how I try to position my role in risk and compliance. And I think a really good example of that to start with is the safe arrival of children risk assessment and thinking around the regulation that's in place for that and start to consider how that underpins quality practice. And, if we don't have a risk assessment in place for a transition and we don't think about those risks, then essentially we could be, impacting the health and safety of the children we care for. So, but back to your question, absolutely there to sort of more guide and support understanding the regs rather than quote them is how I would say.
Yeah, so I guess when I started in the sector many moons ago, and less wrinkles, and probably less Coke bottles on my face with my glasses, I never really thought about this idea of risk. I never really thought about regulations. I mean, I guess you're working in the outside of school hours sector. When I worked in that space, there was people who really didn't do formalized qualifications and different aspects around that. Like, what would your advice be in the beginning about like risk? Like what does that mean? Whose responsibility is that to keep children safe?
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on it before as well, Jamie. I mean, risk really, it is everyone's responsibility to work with children to keep them safe. And I think, a really great way to start thinking about risk is planning and prevention. And organisations and staff need to get together and thinking about, and this happens in everyday practice and the organisations I've worked for, it certainly happens, but thinking about how do we identify risk, how do we then think about our control measures and manage it. But back to your question, it's, everyone's responsibility. Absolutely, that works for children.
Barbie,
Yeah.
a couple of podcasts ago, you spoke about, there was a yard that was built on, I think,
Oh,
some unsafe stuff, right? And it was interesting how you broke that down around, I think we used the
um,
word risk benefit.
yeah. So I say a service I worked at, the school was built on a glass tip.
Mhm.
So the tip used to only have glass or crockery, and so it was under everything. So kids would be randomly digging it out of the sandpit, under the play equipment, under the oval. But it was, instead of just doing the no shoes on, no one playing the sandpit, da 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 da. Kind of wanted to work around that because we had quite an active team in, I guess, looking at how to overcome that risk. And then with Eric, I know we're talking to him, that planning and prevention side. I,
Mm.
I know a lot of people are like, oh, another risk assessment, but I find that risk assessment is that planning and prevention side, and you way rather be proactive
Mm.
instead of reactive. So on that, obviously, once I didn't know at the start, I actually kept getting told, like, it was like the school at the time, it was like it was not ignored, but no one would ever reply to me on anything when I asked about where is this class coming from. It was like they knew, but no one wanted to touch it. I got Safe Work New South Wales come in, depending on the size of your organisation. For anyone in New South Wales or even the Safe Work Australia, every state may be different to what they do, but they come in and they do free audits for your organization. I think as if you're less than 50 employees, again, I'm saying I think, but it's a great resource to have in that it helped with me. Obviously, you have whatever's in the regs, have to have that child safe environment and quality area too. We did only get meeting in. I couldn't get exceeding for that physical factor
Oh,
of
you look
being
so
on a glass.
disappointed.
Do,
Oh,
do you
Barbie.
know, and I'm too honest, if I didn't put it in, like our quip or anything, how would they know we were on a glass tip? Like there was no way they could have known, but I'd still rather be honest because I liked how our team had to think of that and be really mindful because if they found glass, it didn't mean, okay, there's a broken bottle, like a normal check you might do. It was like, okay, maybe there's been a lot of rain over the weekend. We've got to go do a perimeter check. Like it was such a different thing that would affect how we would then go look for where things might be. Or if a kid said they found one in a certain spot, you'd then go double check that area because it was often to do with obviously the soil moving,
Yeah.
someone going digging as far as they could down in the sandpit. But with safe work, it was really good having them come in to help mitigate. Obviously, talking to them, I could be like, we still want to use all of this. What can we do? Coming up with ideas on that. They did flag, and I gather it's common in schools, so we might not notice those macadamia trees above the eating areas. And
Oh,
so many of us,
wow.
yeah,
I
yeah.
guess
And
it's
so,
the allergen there with nuts,
uh-huh.
right? But that's super
But
cool.
I never noticed because I don't know how we never noticed, but there was the big massive trees that over covered the whole eating area, and it was like how you work with that. Instead of seeing it, I guess, as a issue, it was, I thought, really good working through it, and even just the mitigation of, it wasn't mitigating liability, but making sure what even the glass we were finding, especially from under the ground, was recorded. I used to email it to the principal every term. Didn't get a reply, but it was just making sure I was doing that. That was safe works advice. Just making sure I was doing what I could. So, and anything we put in place, I think we didn't stop any play in any areas unless there was a heavy rain or heavy exposure for any reason. We didn't want it to prevent that play. We were pretty good at being preventative in the injury side. I don't know if we ever had an injury on it. It may have only been once, if that, but I don't recall. I feel like we had more injuries on the flat footpath. It's like the kids less, and myself, we think less when we're walking on a flat. Like it's like we're peripheral, we're not even extra thinking. Whereas as soon as you're on uneven turf or something, you seem to be way more aware of your senses and like, oh, I better
Yeah.
step over that. So
Yeah.
um, there's me on my random side quest on talking
No,
about that.
I think that's great, Barbie, because I guess for myself, like this idea of risk minimization, and I don't think anyone wakes up in the morning and goes, I really want someone to break their arm today. Oh,
Yeah.
that'd be great, wouldn't it? And I don't think anyone really, unless you're a psychopath, and I think there's probably 0.001% of the population think let's have children hurt themselves. And I've always been an advocate for risk benefit play. I've had services over the years have fire pits. I've had, there's a service the other day, and I work in the long daycare space, Eric, with where there was tinkering, where 2-year-old children were with hammer and nails, tinkering and playing with tools. And I've had children do cooking experiences where, they might cut up the fruit, soft fruit like bananas and stuff, for their afternoon tea from a self help perspective and learning around that. So I think this idea, as we start talking about compliance and risk from my perspective, is how do we ensure children are kept safe? How do we ensure that we have this conversation as every person's responsibility? And in some way, how do we don't just drive to work and go, oh, you know what I'm doing today? I'm going to have a fire pit with the children and just do it without thinking. So I guess, Eric, I don't know if you agree with that, but I'm curious in your role, what are the steps to thinking about this idea of risk? Because I know departmental people from different states come through and they say, do you have a risk assessment for this? Or do you have a risk? And I just think, man, that's just a piece of paper. Like that's in a folder that's dusty that maybe some people bring out sometimes and should use it as a tool, of course. But I think you can have procedures and policies in play, but really it's the real stuff around what it looks like in a sense of bringing people together. So in your world, Eric, what does that look like?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what you're saying, what Barbie has said. I think we need to be reminded that there's risk in everything we do. Driving to work this morning is a risk.
Mm.
And I think we also need to be reminded that in our role in Ush, we are educators as well. So we also have a responsibility to be teaching the children about risk, about managing risk, and taking calculated risk. So it's funny with what you said there before, Barbie, because sometimes our operational teams do like to just inquire or throw a little bit of a joke there about a bit of a risky activity to see what reaction they get from me. But coming back to your point, absolutely, we need to think about the risk benefit of activities, and sometimes when I'm speaking with operational teams, we absolutely do need to go through the process of having a risk assessment. I would hope it's not in a dusty folder.
Yeah, totally.
I, I would be hoping
I
that
should
it's
explain. That never happens.
I'd be hoping that it's developed with the team because if it's one person developing a risk assessment, it's undermining the reason for doing that activity, right? We need to have a risk assessment. We also need to have our team aware of those risks and how we're going to manage those risks. So that's one side of it. But then I'll touch on the other side, which I mentioned before about educating the children. And so a practice that some of our services like to do is actually encourage children to do their own risk assessments. So, a child might come up with a suggestion. I would love to have McDonald's for afternoon tea. Probably not the best example, but encouraging educators to go back to those children and say, can you do a risk assessment? Sorry, let's use a tree climbing activity. That's probably a better example.
I think Bacchus was good. I think it's both are good.
But yeah, encouraging the children to be involved in that process because that's teaching them about risk. It's teaching them to identify it and think about and make calculated decisions about how they can manage it themselves.
Yeah, interesting. So, how do we bring the children on the journey so they can also be part of that self regulation if there is something that is a little bit on the riskier side? And I know in the long day care space as well, I think children, I think of all ages, verbally or non-verbally, can also communicate what that may or may not look like as well. So, taking in consideration the steps, that's interesting.
I think, sorry, Eric, you go.
Yeah, no, I thanks, Barbie. I think it is. It's actually a really good practice, and I actually, it makes my job really enjoyable when I do visit centres and I walk around with a child and they share this great idea about an activity they would love to do, and at first I think, well, maybe not, maybe we can't do that here, but then walking around with the child, getting them involved in that process, it really does make you think, well, yes, I'm risk and compliance coordinator. That's my role to keep safeguard the organisation and keep children safe. But we also need to go back and think about, who are we here for? And that's the children. And if that's the interest, we need to think about, well, we need to have that open mindset about risk, I think. And I think that process does a really good job of that, walking through with the children and hearing their thoughts and perspectives.
Yeah, because it's like sometimes on the risk front, I think in my mind, I probably had the parents. Obviously, you got your approved provider of the school, but often I was thinking, what would a parent think of X? Like when we started tree climbing and stuff. But then really it's like, remembering that lens of the child, like who are we here for? If on that risk side too, like I guess that's where the risk benefit comes into a big play. Obviously, it's the children. I want to say it's the children, obviously, that benefit, but I think even staff, I know with the service I was at, when we introduced a lot more risky play and loose parts play, and it's like structure without structure too. So having both sides, behavior issues kind of decreased. There was more choice, there was more freedom in what they were doing. They got more say in the direction, and I was a bit like yourself, Eric. If they wanted to do something, even if it was McDonald's for afternoon tea, that's a great example because it'll be like, it depends. I'm picturing actual children I remember having, and I could remember if one asked for that, they would probably go get we had this happen. I can't remember what they did, but they got a clipboard and went around and surveyed all the staff on something. It was something that one of the children wanted and got all their answers to try and put it's like they're great debaters and to put their argument together of why we should have, I'm probably click after this episode what it was, but it was something like McDonald's, and then argue the benefits of it for that, like the team morale it might bring, or like for that day. Like, yes, there's this health side, but then they might suggest, well, we'll also have fruit platters, like balancing it all out. But I find children's minds are really good at thinking of the other factors, I guess, on the benefit side that could come into play. I also like doing it similar with staff. It might depend on your staff as well and how long yourself, whether you're a leader and you've been there, or maybe you're a new staff member at a service that's quite risk um,
Reverse.
encouraged. Well,
Oh,
no, you may come from a risk averse background. It could be just that's what your approved provider or that service was like, and you go somewhere else that's the opposite.
yeah.
It can be a lot to take on board. I know I've had staff of all different levels of what they were comfortable to do. So we worked with that. We didn't ban the children from doing those activities. It was just certain staff didn't feel comfortable with supervising tree climbing or other set activities, but balance out in the team. But I think in that having that, they all understand why it exists, whether it's a risk assessment or a rule in place of why you can play here or can't play there. I think them understanding and having that conversation where whether it's the children or the staff know more of the background plays a big part in then how they take that on board. Whether it's like, oh, we can't go on the equipment today, or like, oh, okay, we can't go on the equipment today, can play a big part to the mentality of how they look at the risk, I find.
Yeah, and I think Barbie, you touched on a really important point there with risk as well, particularly if you are programming experiences that may have a higher risk level. Let's use the example of the tree climbing in this instance. I'm sure there would be some families that would arrive at your service seeing a couple of children climbing a tree and would be completely fine with that and think that's great, the children having a great time. And you might see some other families walk in and think, wow, what are the children doing here? Like this, someone's going to hurt themselves. So I think the education for families is a really big part for those services who do want to plan those activities, which might have a little bit more risk involved. So I know in the past we've had sort of family, open days or mentoring sessions explaining the program, explaining the reason behind the activities and what the benefits are. Because again, for those high risk activities, there's a very fine line between it being perceived as a learning experience and a service being negligent, essentially in a parent's view. So that education is just so important for families.
That makes so much sense. And I mean, Eric, before we went live with the recording today, just as we were kind of warming up to go click record, you shared something interesting. So you've not just been in this sector. I mean, of course, you were in the education system that Barbie brought you into the brighter side of life. Is it true that you worked in aged care as well?
Yeah, so at Three Bridges, we have our outside school hours care services, but we also have aged care services through home care packages. So I'm fortunate enough to work with a diverse range of services for different age groups. Yeah.
Oh, my mistake. I thought that was a separate, but it's actually part of
No,
Three.
yeah, and recently too. That's why I was
Oh,
like, and
wow.
I just had been talking to Eric, and I was so curious on like, oh, how was that? Like, understanding from yes, they're completely different sectors, but so similar at the same time.
What are the similarities?
Yeah, great question, Jamie. I think, you're very right in what we discussed before. There are USH and aged care are very similar in that they're governed by a framework. So we have a regulatory body in USH. That's obviously a CEQA. In the aged care space, we have the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission.
Oh, right.
So we have a regulatory body. We have a legislative framework. Let's go with framework. I can't say that word today. So we have the laws and regs in USH. We have the Aged Care Act in that space. So and there's also an accreditation process as well for providers. So similar to assessment and rating. When you're applying for a license and then an ongoing monitoring and review by the regulatory body.
Yeah, rightly so. I mean, I know over the years, while we sometimes see some bad press in our sector, I've definitely have seen some bad press in the aged care sector as well. Um, and I guess at the end of the day, the commonality is that we're working with human beings and the complexity of this idea of safety and compliance. And is it my understanding that aged care also has a ratio as well?
Uh, Depending, I guess, what area of aged care you work in,
Yeah.
certainly does have the ratio. So our organisation has more of home care packages. So we provide services for clients within the home rather than residential care.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. There's a lot of compliance in that space as well. I'll use an example, and I'm sure a lot of bush providers will appreciate this example. And in the aged care space, we utilise some third-party service providers. So, we're thinking about who we're sending into a client's home. We're making sure they've got
Yeah.
their police checks. They've got the right training to provide service to our clients. So, very similar to if you're engaging someone for a vacation care activity as a visitor to your service, I'm sure you'd be checking, working with children's check. I'm sure they'd have their insurances. So, a lot of similarities in the compliance aspect.
So that's interesting. So you talked about some of the setups, making sure those things are occurring, and my mind went to inductions. So we have all these procedures, policies. Some organizations are lucky to have a compliance person like yourself at early learning management. We also have a dedicated team of people as well from the pedagogy and compliance space as well. So I think it is an important aspect, but not everyone has the privilege of that. And this idea of having processes and systems, but it's all well and good if no one's been trained about that. What is your viewpoint around inductions and training, and what might that look like in your world?
Yeah, you're so right, Jamie. Inductions are crucial. You can have the best systems and processes in place, but if your staff aren't trained in them or they're not aware of those processes, then you can't expect them to be able to follow it or utilize those systems effectively. So, at Three Bridges, induction is absolutely key. And I think for all providers, and most providers in our sector will appreciate that the induction plays a crucial role in really, as that first step of joining an organisation, in really understanding this is how we do things here, this is how we safeguard the organisation, and this is what to do if something goes wrong as well.
And I
Yeah.
don't know.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry,
sorry,
go ahead.
Jamie. I don't know the statistic off my. I can't say words today either, Eric. I can't say the statistic off the top of my head, but there's a huge percentage that, say, a new employee will actually decide to leave a job in that induction process, pending how that induction goes, whether or not they like the employer, the pay, the service, the kids. It can play a big part into it. And as you were talking to, I write notes. I forgot to say I'm a hand writer as we talk. And how important they are to utilize. I also think how you give an induction, whether it's everyone does it differently, whether people have looked into how they do their process and who does it. Because you can
Yes.
have a brilliant document written perfectly amazing, it's really engaging 100% if you're on a test. But if someone's giving it that doesn't have probably the right demeanor for whoever's been inducted, because it could be completely different to how you and I break down things too much, don't I, as I say this, but how you might induct a new educator, never worked in Orsh, maybe their first job, high school, uni, to maybe someone that's worked in the profession for 10 years, or to then even an executive level. How we induct, I think, at every level, and who and what with plays a big part. But I don't think people really think too much on the who. um, Certain people are better at it than others. I obviously get sidetracked. I wasn't always the best because I'll be like, oh, look, there's something shiny over there. And I'm happy to admit that. Whereas I had some amazing other people on my team that were great with people, really personable, could build that rapport. Because this person, I don't know about you guys, I remember your first time even walking into new places and you're like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. So someone that makes them feel at ease, especially if the induction's on site before a shift or with a shift. Other places do it in a room with other people. So thinking of the energy that person might have. I don't know if you have any other idea, because I like also when we talk about stuff, if we give an idea on how they can then move forward if they're thinking about that practice, like their own inductions and what they could do. I know Jamie and I heard a great tip the other day, which we didn't think about. And this is why I like the cross-sector insights, like the aged care inputs into here. But we had a HR kind of expert, I shouldn't say kind of, HR expert on, Tani, and she recommended gamifying inductions. And I remember Jamie's just like, what? like even though we work with children, we're all about play. It's like we didn't even think about the gamified sense of educators we're bringing in as a possible way that might work, pending who it was
Yeah.
appealing to.
No, yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. Barbi. I think the only thing I'd add on there is gamifying is a great approach.
How good is that?
I think, if we go back to our policies, and if I was being inducted to an organisation, I would absolutely want to know their policies because it's my responsibility to follow those as an employee. I think a really good approach that our team like to use is creating scenarios during that induction. So you could have the policy there, and I'm sure some organisations you would read through the policy, yep, sign off, done. But by having those scenarios, it makes it more meaningful and it puts it into context of how to apply that into practice, and that's the difference. I think by having that more hands-on play scenario-based approach, because as you touched on, Barbi, our workforce is very diverse. We've got people who've been in the sector for 20 years plus, and then we've got, I guess, people who've never worked in the sector before, didn't even know it exists, and might be studying at uni. So, as a provider, we do have a responsibility to make sure that induction is comprehensive and it is information that can be applied in practice. And yeah, I would encourage the scenario-based approach is really effective.
I think that's great. I like this idea of inductions, and I thought that you might feel that would be really important because prevention is much better than reaction, right? And it's how can we be as preventative as we can. For us at ELM, Early Learning Management, we currently serve 98 centres around the country, and that's about 2,800 employees, there's no mean feat there. And we identified a bit of a gap about 2.5 years ago. And because of our scale of helping to support the individual approved providers around the country and approved providers coming to us to help them for a variety of reasons, we actually crafted and created our own learning management software program. And so in that learning management software program, we created micro learnings, and in the micro learnings, it connects to the policies that people would read, acknowledge, and then watch the videos that's got 3 to 4 competency questions at the end. But what we learned over time is that's one way of learning. Yes, we can track it. Yes, we can show it. But there's nothing better than in a center like what you're saying, Barbi, of one, who is the person who's doing the meet and greeting? And that's also a cultural perspective, showing where the anaphylaxis medical action plans are, and the communication plans. Where's the emergency evacuation plans? Where are the risk assessments that aren't dusty, but they're actually there, and sitting down and having some inquiry. But what we learned over the last couple of years was, yes, some services do it really, really well, but some services around the country that are remote, that don't have people, what they were doing was they're like, okay, you've got a heartbeat. Okay, cool, great. You've got your working with children check, handball like AFL football, and good luck. And off they go into classrooms in the long day care space. And we actually had to do a lot of education with centre managers. And what we said is, we understand that you might be a little bit short staffed. I get it. But you are going to be short staffed if someone leaves. So why don't you dedicate a day to 2 days where people actually start on their first day of 2 and not put them in classroom settings or ratios or time block maybe the first couple of hours in the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, and maybe there's some observation. And also center managers are quite stretched thin, or coordinators in the outside school hours world. How can you get champions in a service that have been in the service that really represent good quality interactions with children, really is that person that if there is any questions that they can go to. And even while a staff member might be allocated to a specific classroom, maybe for those first couple of days they're in a different classroom setting where they can model those behaviors of what good and great looks like. And then after a couple of days, they then get allocated to where their business as usual, their home classroom are going to be as well. So, I think inductions and onboarding, I think it should be an ongoing conversation. I also think when I lived in America and worked for an organization that had 2,500 centers across America, and no mean feat there. And what I learned about inductions is this idea of what is the first 100 days.
Mm.
So not just what the first day or two or pre-employment, but actually induction should be an ongoing process where it really should take about 100 days of the employee's first bit of employment to go, we're going to be putting some rigor. We're going to, yes, do some checklists to make sure we don't forget anything. But how do we customize where people are at? And also asking the employee a question at different checkpoints. What don't you know yet? What do you know? And you can do that with, I've done that in the past with like Google Forms. So Google, everyone uses Google, and you can easily set up
I
that for
don't.
free. It's true. And then you
I
can do
don't.
a nice Google form, send out a link, and then you can get people to ask questions, or even if people don't want to do this out of working hours, allocate 15 minutes into a before school care space before the children come, or leave after before school care, or before or after, or in the long day care space. Could you extend someone's lunch break for an extra 10 minutes where they can fill out that survey just to get data around what don't you know yet, or what have you learned, what's that experience been? Because as you build that up over time, you're going to get some good data to do that critical reflection space about what could we do differently, and how are we doing things well, and what does this onboarding induction process look like. So I think sometimes induction just feels really onerous and really cumbersome, and like, oh my god, I've got to do all this. But really, I see it like a bank. Like, the more money you put in, the more return you're going to get. And investing time into our new hires, I think, is going to help keep children safe and actually keep people for the longer term.
Yeah, absolutely, Jamie. And I love the idea that you touched on there with micro learning, because I think it's such a good practice to have for an organization to avoid those documents being stored in that dusty folder.
Yeah.
That common. And you're absolutely right, because our policies and procedures and our risk assessments, they're evolving. And, our risk assessments evolve as incidents occur, or a great practice is to review our risk assessments when incidents do occur, because what we need to be considering, what measures we can implement to avoid future recurrence of something similar happening. So that micro learning is a great strategy, I find, for services to make those documents more meaningful through that ongoing reflection. And we are reflective practitioners, that's our sector. So we should be continuously reviewing them. So I really do love that comment. And I think the other thing to touch on there is, you're absolutely right. When an incident does occur, a reactive approach takes 10 times longer than a proactive approach. So from a productivity point of view, it is like that bank that you referred to. It is definitely far better to
Mm.
put the groundwork in and have a really strong induction and training process than to not do that and then have something go wrong, and then you're then responding to sort of an incident. So completely appreciate what you said there. Yeah, spot on.
I know
So,
one.
oh,
Oh,
sorry,
sorry,
Barbi.
Jamie. I
No,
keep
no,
doing.
it's okay.
As you're talking about inductions and how you were describing them too, Jamie, I wrote down actually kids. I know this is on the risk side, but I think it can play in the same way of I was reflecting myself on. I didn't always look into how we induct children technically into our service.
Mhm.
Maybe the kindies, we think so much more of it, especially when we had a breach, we had a kindy child leave. So that whole induction process changed a lot. But what about, I'm just making up names, Sally, who's starting with you Monday, year 4, just moved, da 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 da. How do we induct children into our service? How do we make their first 100 days? Like, you can make or break them wanting to go, which on the parent side, if my child doesn't want to go to USH, it's hard to get them to school. Which for us, we've been lucky that USH is what helps us get our daughter to school. But I would love people listening to even reflect, or even feel free to share if anyone sees this on socials anywhere. If you do an induction for children, whether it's kindy, because I do notice a lot of people do think heavily on the kindy side, or any other new children starting throughout the school year, the beginning of the year, how do you induct them and their families? Because again, on that risk and compliance side, same with staff. I always interrelate kids and staff, I've noticed. I didn't do it as much in practice, just now in hindsight. How they feel or where they've come from, maybe they've already been in a service again that was more risky and now they're in a less risky one, or vice versa, can make a big difference to how comfortable they are. I noticed because when we started adding more risk-based play to our program, you get a lot more kindy parents, a bit like, oh, your kids play outside. That's a genuine comment we had. But because their early learning service had a small, big fence area outside, to them, they just assumed that the kindy kids didn't play outside. So I then started mitigating that on how I got the information to them before they started. So setting that premise already in place with the families at the orientations they do and stuff, and started talking a bit more on our play experiences at those open days. Because usually you talk about, I don't know, I can't remember. It was probably really generic at the start, but then I started sharing more of the pictures on a slideshow of some of these different types of play we do, but also letting them know to approach us on what they're comfortable with their child doing or not. It was usually the parent that wanted their kid not doing anything was the kid that wanted to do everything.
Of
I
course.
don't know. Yeah, it's always the way, like the one that's running wild, upside down, blah, blah, and the mum's like, I want them to stay inside. But it helped really set in those conversations early on. But I have to admit, I only thought to start doing that more when I started getting those comments from families. But it's that evolving in what we do, the critical reflection, like, oh, they didn't know about this. I better let them know. They don't know we do tree climbing because the school doesn't. I better let them know. Even when our school changed principals, because we had a few, I made sure to let this one know we do tree climbing. A, because it took a lot for me to get it across the previous principal. I didn't want this new one to get rid of it. But also B, to then them not to be shocked there was kids in a tree after school. Like they knew we had I shared more on the risk assessment and stuff like that. Just so many things. It's like that information sharing and being mindful of, you may know it, you may do it every day, or it's just ingrained in you, but that doesn't mean this person coming into your world, or maybe even a long-time educator just may not see it the same way as you, and being really mindful of that in that induction. But even in how we do risk, something may seem really risky to you and you're like, what were you thinking? I think I said that about 5 times to my 3-year-old this morning, but in his mind he's like, I'm
What were you
Batman.
thinking?
Yeah, he loves superheroes at the moment.
Oh,
Batman.
nice.
So like he loves going on high things and trying to
Jumping off.
jump.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what's there. His sister. It's like, but then same thing with educators. They may just see the play aspect, which is a good
Mhm.
thing, but may not think of the afterthought is getting that working with them, and not that it's a bad thing. Like I've wrote it down before, but it was like, it's not about having all the answers, I guess, in it. It's about having the courage to kind of ask the right questions along the way,
Yeah.
experiment, but within your risk limits, your service risk limits. But that's how you, by asking, you can learn more. Like it may be a big no of something. We keep using tree climbing because I guess that's something that is, or even shoes off. I know services that won't let shoes off. I think I've said this before, it's probably Jamie too, but it's like, okay, but if your children really want shoes off for certain reasons, how you go about implementing that instead of just getting, if you're an
Mm.
educator and you're really annoyed with it, or you're a parent and you're annoyed with it, it's a bit different on that angle, but just working
I
through
mean, Barbie, what's really resonating with me, Eric, I'd love you to kind of respond about this, but if we're talking about this idea of risk and compliance and all these things, there's a little bit of an art of negotiation as well. Negotiating with families and in the outside of school hours world, where I remember when I worked at outside of school hours, like it was like the after school care children, and I'm like, they're all the same
it.
children.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're all the same. They don't just like a costume, and they're just completely different. And how to also do the art of negotiation with teachers who love to have a classroom environment which is quite orderly, where children, when they come into the outside of school hour space, it's more of that leisure space and
Mm.
having that freedom. But like, what advice might you have around this idea of even families as well, getting them to be educated about what that might be, to bring them on the journey?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Jamie. I think probably going back to your relationships with the key stakeholders around your service, so the school and your families, is really important, because that's going to allow you to have those open, those honest, and those informative conversations around risk and what you do, why you do that, and what are the concerns with certain activities. So I think that element does come back to your relationship with those stakeholders. And, the schools that we work with, and particularly schools that we have a positive relationship with, we're able to continuously, speak with those key stakeholders and work with them collaboratively, because it is a shared space, and ultimately most ushers operate out of shared spaces. And that ongoing relationship allows us to, modify the environment as we need to for certain activities, or go back to our preparation, prepare, and make sure that, if we are doing maybe an activity of higher risk, that, maybe we can have the space 10 minutes early on that certain day to do certain modifications. So I think the relationships are really, really important there. And one other thing that, Barbi, that you sort of sparked in my mind when you were speaking was around the not wearing shoes. And I thought I
Mm,
would share that. It sort of reminded me that when we are assessing risk and when we are planning activities, we need to be mindful of our own biases and our own experiences for risk.
mm,
And the reason why you sparked my thinking then was, when I was younger, I stubbed my toe really badly on concrete when I wasn't wearing shoes. So
Yeah.
straight away, that made me feel uncomfortable thinking about that. But again, going back and having that open mind and planning around how we could make that a safe experience, we need to really be thinking around that and trying to remove our own biases, because otherwise we could be limiting educational experiences for our children.
mm. Yeah, and how important, like, even if it's just touching ground, like if they're outside playing on grass, and I know that's a big area where people don't, but what if there could be reasons like a glass tip. What if they're sitting down in a group activity and they're not on that area? Like, there's just so many ways around it. And just, I know for my children, it's quite calming for them. It helps them regulate. Like, I know we've got co-regulation, but we can use our environment as well. Depending what you've got in it can make a big difference in helping with that regulation. And I think we forget about that. There's like this, we think of the physical risk and forget the emotional risk of not doing things as well at the same time. With a lot of these things, by saying no to everything, what's that emotional risk then on the children? And especially where our school hours cares, they've focus on emotional and social development, but then we say no to all these things that can help that. There's just that symbiotic relationship between the two, and whether you get that, I was about to say the yin and yang, but that's the good and the bad, and the bad and the good, but making sure they're balanced out well, um, in your own practices, and rethinking if it's your own bias. Whereas I'm also very conscious, I have a bias of being very child focused. I'll be like, of course the kids can do that, why not? Forgetting how much extra pressure they might put on staff, whether they're comfortable with it, whether it makes their job 10 times harder in that moment, and it's not necessarily. So there's all these other things, like, I know I have to be a lot conscious of, um, and vice versa.
So I guess we've covered so much today. We talked about risk, that it's everybody's responsibility. We spoke about really thinking things through. I don't think we're trying to talk about children being put into bubbles. We talked about inductions and relationships and everything. But Eric, if there was one thing that you would love to advise educators of any level that you would like them to take away from this podcast, or even something that we haven't covered yet, what would that be?
Hmm. Yeah, I think, just reflecting on your comment there, what really stands out that is that risk and compliance is part of everything that we do. So I think for an educator to take away from this conversation, I would recommend that if you feel like you're not aware of your organisation's policies or procedures, or you feel like, maybe you haven't had an induction that supports you to be able to identify risk or compliance, or have those meaningful conversations with families, use your initiative to go to your supervisor, or your non supervisor, or your approved provider, whoever the point of contact is, and have an honest conversation and say, I'd really love to learn a little bit more around risk, or I'd really love to be a part of, assessing risk for the next excursion. Take that initiative to be a part of the process, because ultimately, as educators, you have the responsibility, as we touched on before, to keep children safe, and you are accountable to do that. So, take the initiative, be part of that process, and it's when it's a meaningful process, it is really enjoyable. And at the end of the day, you get to see the children enjoy an experience, that maybe if it wasn't planned, or you didn't consider the benefits of that risk, the activity may not have occurred.
Yeah, so really be self-driven and do some advocacy work and ask questions. Sometimes in our sector, we're really worried about talking to that point person that you, so to speak, going, "Will I be in trouble?" And I think taking away that mindset and asking questions and being curious about how things operate if you're uncertain to have that clarity. And I mean, that makes a bunch of sense. But I guess just thinking about wrapping up just a little bit on this conversation, we do love to have every podcast end with a question. Barbie, do you want to ask it?
Yeah, I'm always bad at it, but I'm fine at it because
Yeah,
then
you're good at it. You're
it
good.
adds to it. So we tend to ask, well, if you've been listening, you may already know actually, we tend to ask people what was their first, Jamie and I started asking what was their first live like gig they went to, performance, but then we
There
realized
was
that
one person who
people,
didn't go to a gig.
yeah, but not everyone likes music. So that's our
Yeah.
own bias. So we're like, well, other people might like other live, whether it's theatre or other type of things. But for us, the goal is to elicit those positive memories. Well, hopefully positive. But are you a live music person?
No, I'm not. I'm not.
See?
That's two
Oh,
people now. I've joined.
Oh,
I've
yeah.
and
joined.
that's so fine. Have you ever got, like, what was your first memory of seeing anything that was a live show, live performance, a live anything?
Oh, tough one on the spot. I was not expecting this question, but now I'm thinking for some reason the first thing that does come to mind is The Lion King at the movies. So
Oh, cool. So a movie. We haven't had a movie one yet.
Yeah.
maybe a
Just
movie. Maybe we'll go with that
wait.
option. But the soundtrack for The Lion King, amazing, and that just comes to mind when you ask that question. So I'm going to stick with that.
Okay, so favorite Lion King song.
Oh, Circle of Life. Can't
Okay,
can't
classic,
go
You didn't need
past it.
classic.
you didn't need to think of that one. You're like that.
Talking about our own biases, that movie definitely sometimes comes on when I'm in the centre or when I was working in the centre
And did you go by yourself or did you go with people?
with family. Yeah, quite
Um,
young. I think I was maybe 5 or 6 when it was released. So definitely a good
Yeah.
movie.
haven't shared this yet, but my very first movie that I went to, I was in year 3, and this is going to show my age, but Terminator Part 2 came out at the movies, and I was living in Wollongong, and I went by myself.
Scary? Oh, I'm a scaredy cat though, so I think Harry
I
Potter's
was all
scary.
for it. Terminator 2 is my example.
No, I hate the following thing. I hate someone always following you type thing, but that's way sidetracked on that.
That Lion
No,
King classic. That's cool.
yeah. And then our goal with that is that has that positive memory usually to people when you see them, and especially when Jamie asks you who you went with, you can see people thinking, oh, yeah, that family memory experience on that side. But yeah, no, thank you so much, Eric. I know on my end, I actually wrote a lot, but main thing for anyone listening is like, who are we here for in what you do? And a reminder that there's risk in everything we do. And then it's just what we do about it. Oh, and I love the regulations. Sorry, I didn't say that
We all
earlier.
love the
So, genuinely.
Thank you so much, Eric. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for listening to The Bold Blueprint.
If you'd like to get in touch, you can reach out to us on
elm.net.au or
fireflyhr.com.au.
bye.
Bye.